What's up, you guys? Void here, coming back at you with another deck tech video. This one is yet again another patron requested video by one of my awesome patrons, Ogamon. He requested of me a deck tech for Nath of the Gilt-Leaf, and he wanted me to do more of an elf tribal variation of the deck. For the most part, he is well known for being a pretty powerful stacks commander. Let's just read off what he does here real quickly. He's 5 mana for a 4/4 elf warrior. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you may have target opponent discard a card at random. That is very important. Usually, discard effects, your opponent gets to choose what they want to discard. This has to be at random, so it definitely hurts them. It has a higher chance of them discarding something they don't want to discard. And he also has, whenever an opponent discards a card, you may create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token, which is also pretty good. And it's exactly what we want with elves. Elves are amazing in numbers. They have a lot of lords among them. And you'll have a ton of mana to work with this type of deck, but you also have the token strategy to take advantage of. However, I also want to focus with this deck on stacks. It's very important. You want to, just the whole engine of forcing your opponents to discard cards, and you can profit off of that, get tokens, means that you can run cards like Smokestack, things that are going to force everybody to sack permanents. Well, tokens are technically considered permanents. We want to take advantage of that. So let's get into the actual deck here. Let's start off with the lands. We're going to talk about these pretty quickly. There are some noteworthy ones. We have Cabal Coffers and Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. Pretty typical of black decks or even two-color decks. If you can run Urborg, it's pretty good. It makes everything you have considered a swamp. So it automatically makes Cabal Coffers much better, and you can add a whole bunch of black mana. You could also throw in a Guy's Cradle in here, or even the new Itlamok land, but I don't know, I just don't really like it too much. I think there's enough mana to work with. I just like these two because we don't typically have the best way of getting a lot of black mana. We have a ton of elves that can tap for green mana. That's not really that big of a deal. But when we run into the problem in this deck, it would probably be with black mana, so we need some more black mana generation, and that's why we have Cabal Coffers. Westfell Abbey is just an auto-include in token decks in general. It's amazing. Sacrifice 5 tokens, that's not a tough thing to do at all in this deck, and you get Ormondal, Profane Prince, which is just insanely powerful in Commander. And we have Strip Mine because this is resource denial. And Gilt-Leaf Palace is one of those lands you could kind of ditch if you really don't need it. All it is essentially just a dual land if you have an elf in your hand. It's a bit too expensive for just that. I think there's a lot cheaper mana fixing. Then you have Path of Ancestry because this is more or less a tribal based deck, and getting the Scry trigger and also getting perfect mana fixing for your deck is also pretty good too. Now we move on to the creatures. This is elf tribal, so we're going to see a lot of elves here. Joraga Warcaller. He's essentially an anthem when he's kicked multiple times. The more you kick him, the bigger the anthem is, so he's a pretty big deal if you can get him on later game. Then you have Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic. They're basically the same creature. Tap for 1 green mana, pretty basic. Elves of Deep Shadow can tap for black mana, which is also pretty important, but it does hit you for 1, so that is kind of a downside, but not that big of a deal too much. Deathrite Shaman is all around versatile, and one of the best 1-drops in the entire game, period. Just that much versatility. It's good late game, it's good mid game, it's good early game. Just whatever you need, really. If you need to gain life, it's there. If you need to get rid of an instant or sorcery in an opponent's graveyard, that's also good. A creature in their graveyard, that's also good. You could also just use it to ramp early game, which is pretty good because there's a lot of fetches in this format. Then we have Priest of Titania. She can tap for 1 green mana for each elf on the battlefield, including your opponent's elves. That's a big deal. Can give you a ton of mana. Wood Elves can get you a basic land from your deck on the battlefield tapped. Simple, but it's good ramp. Elvish Harbinger can get you an elf from your deck and put it onto the top of your library. Can also tap for 1 mana, so that's also pretty good. And the Reclamation Sage, very good, very underrated. ETBs, lets you destroy an artifact or an enchantment. Always good in these types of decks where you don't necessarily have the best non-creature removal. Elvish Champion and Elvish Archdruid are very similar. Archdruid is essentially like another Priest of Titania, but it's also a lord. It gives an anthem to all of your elves, and Elvish Champion is also a lord. Gives +1/+1 to all your elves, and just gives them Forest Walk, which is pretty nice. They have Imperious Perfect. Yet another lord, gets +1/+1, but can also tap to create a 1/1 elf. Pretty nice. If Azuri Renegade Leader, we can tap it to regenerate an elf, but we can also pay the mana to essentially give all of our elves an overrun type effect. So they're going to be pushing through, dealing a lot more damage. We're going to be able to seal the deal, push in for extra damage if we need it. Pretty nice. Eternal Witness isn't an elf, but it's a good 3-drop, helps us recover, stabilize in games. Shaman of the Pack, very cool card for this type of deck, especially green-black elf tribal. We can just have one player lose life equal to the number of elves we control. That's pretty powerful, especially considering we run a token-based deck where we have token elves. That's a lot of elves. Wirewood Channeler, essentially like another Priest of Titania, Elvish Archdruid type effect. Pretty good. Oracle of Moldiah definitely helps speed up the deck if we can top deck lands, put them onto the battlefield. We don't really have to worry about drawing into basic lands, things like that. We don't want that. Also allows you to get an extra land drop, which is pretty nice. Null Mage Shepherd is very cool. You get to tap 4 creatures in order to destroy an artifact or enchantment. That is actually very powerful in this type of deck if we want to make it more or less just elf tribal with a stack shell. Resource denial is pretty good, but anytime you can have consistent removal, non-creature removal is so important in this format. Just tapping down 4 creatures to do that, pretty good. Immaculate Magistrate, we can tap to put +1/+1 counters on a target creature equal to the number of elves we control. That's pretty good. And then we have Lissa Lana Huntmaster. Whenever we cast an elf spell, we get to create a little 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. That's pretty good. Then we have Dwynen Gilt-Leaf Dane. Other elf creatures we control get +1/+1, and whenever it attacks, we gain 1 life for each attacking elf we control. Also has reach, so that's nice. Then we have Creekwood Liege. Other black creatures we control get +1/+1, and other green creatures we control get +1/+1 also. And at the beginning of our upkeep, we get to create a 1/1 black and green worm creature token. So definitely helps the more board presence we have in terms of tokens, in terms of creatures. Later on, we're going to see a lot more stacks-based effects, and this is just important. Then we have Sadistic Hypnotist. It does technically combo out and lock down our opponents. We get to sacrifice an elf token, force an opponent to discard 2 cards. Well, we get 2 more elf tokens. We just get to keep doing that to our opponents until they have no cards left in their hand, so that's pretty good. Then we have Craterhoof Behemoth, because you can't really guarantee yourself a win just off of resource denial. You do kind of have to push in for that extra bit of damage, and whenever you can just tutor this up, put it onto the battlefield, you have a ton of tokens there. You do the math. That's a lot of damage with trample. Now we move on to the artifacts. We have a Skull Clamp, because we do play some 1/1 tokens that we get each upkeep if we're lucky, and we just get to feed it to the clamp and just get to draw 2 cards. That's pretty nice. It's a consistent card draw. Anvil of Bogarden, sort of like a Howling Mine effect, but it's a little bit more oppressive. It forces an opponent to discard a card. So each time an opponent discards a card off of this during their upkeep, they're going to be giving us a 1/1 token as well, so that's pretty nice. And then Lifecrafter's Bestiary. It's going to scry each upkeep, which is also pretty solid manipulation. And every time we cast a creature spell, we get to pay 1 green and draw a card. Again, consistency and card draw, pretty solid. Then we have Geth's Grimoire, which is essentially whenever an opponent discards a card, we get to draw a card. Very good card in this type of deck. We want to focus around those types of abilities in addition to our elves. Then we have Smokestack, because that's exactly what you want with this type of deck. We play a ton of discard effects. It's going to get us a ton of tokens, and we have no problem seeing the number of soot counters on Smokestack go up, because that just means that our opponents are going to be suffering. We just have a ton of token fodder. We can just keep feeding that to Smokestack, and we're likely never going to be hurt by it in terms of mana, so we shouldn't really be too worried about losing to it. But it is a pretty good card. Now we move on to enchantments. We have some pretty solid ones. We have Liliana's Caress. You could also play Megrim if you want to. It's pretty much the same thing, just 1 more mana expensive. I chose to only have 1 of this type of card in the deck. We have some mass discard effects that can force our opponents to lose 2 life, but this one, I mean, just put 1 of them in there. I feel like it's consistent enough. It's solid. Because we also play Waste Not, which is also pretty similar. It's based around your opponent's discarding, but you get way more value off of Waste Not, so that's exactly why I like it. You also get tokens off of it too, which is nice. We also play Bitter Blossom, because hey, more tokens, why not get this out early enough? We can have an army of little 1/1 fairies. It's funny. Then we have Cryptolith Rite, because it's the perfect card for this deck. A ton of tokens means they're all basically Birds of Paradise. Why the hell not? It's good mana fixing, and it's excellent mana ramp. all for just a 2-mana enchantment that sits on the field. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but who cares? It's awesome. Then we have Contamination, because this is a stacks deck, and we do play tokens. So why the hell not just make all of the lands basically swamps? That's a pretty big deal. They can only tap for black mana, which is what I mean. We're pretty much going to be able to sacrifice at least one creature during our upkeep, because we're going to be forcing our opponents to discard a card during our upkeep, and there's likely going to be at least one person that has still one card left in their hand. So why not? They play Necrogen Mists. During each player's upkeep, they have to discard a card. It's just extra discard. Pretty solid. Then we have Bottomless Pit. During each player's upkeep, they have to discard a card from their hand, but it has to be at random, which is way better than Necrogen Mist, because discarding at random is always better. You get to force players to get rid of something that they normally wouldn't want to, because it's completely random. They don't have that control. Then we play Mind Slash, which is also pretty awesome. We get to pay 1 black mana, sacrifice a creature, and we basically just get to Thought Seize our opponents. It's pretty awesome. Gives us that consistency, gives us that hand disruption. Brilliant card, and it helps feed us into our token strategy. Gets us more tokens. They're technically discarding. That's awesome. Then we play Oppression. Whenever a player plays a spell, they have to discard a card. This card is insane. It's going to get us a token army of little elves. It's brilliant. Our opponents are just going to be playing into our hand here. It's exactly what we want. We want more board presence. They're going to keep discarding cards. It really forces them to really slow down. Wait till they top deck removal. We play Grave Pact for obvious reasons. We have a lot of ways to kill our own creatures. Therefore, we're going to be killing our opponent's creatures in the process. Pretty obvious. Then we play Parallel Lives. Play tokens. Why not? This is pretty much one of the biggest auto-includes you could have in a deck like this. In addition to Dictative Erebos, pretty much the same thing as Grave Pact, but it has Flash. Also pretty good. Now on to Sorceries. We do play Green Sun Zenith, because one of the green creatures in the deck that helps us win is Craterhoof Behemoth. If we can hit 8, we can win the game. Then we play Smallpox. Not that big of a deal, but each player has to discard a card, which is a big deal, because it helps us get more tokens. And they also have to sacrifice a land and a creature, so hey, pretty good. Torment of Hellfire, absolutely brilliant card in this type of deck. Basically, each opponent has to do this, which is why it's so good. For every single mana that you put into X, they have to choose either they want to discard a card, sacrifice a non-land permanent, or they lose 3 life. So yes, eventually they're going to be forced to discard cards, which is going to give you more tokens, and it's going to feed into a lot of your other discard triggers. Pretty good card. Dark Deal. Unfortunately, this is really the only wheel in Mono Black, which is kind of a shame, because this is really ideally what you want in the deck. Mass discard. Each opponent is going to be discarding their entire hands. That's pretty epic. As far as the Nath trigger goes, you get a ton of little elf tokens. Also, refilling your hand is pretty nice too. Why not? Death Cloud. Pretty obvious. Yet again, another stacks type effect with Torment of Hellfire, Smokestack, Pox, things like that. Eventually, our opponents are going to be sacking everything. They're not going to have anything left to sack. They're also going to be losing life. It is a little bit more risky, though, than Torment, because you have to have enough life in order for this to be useful. But that's about it, the only downside. It's a pretty epic card. We play Maelstrom Pulse. Pretty consistent green removal. Can't really say too much else about it. Now for Sorceries. We're getting close to the end here. We have Pox, which is basically each opponent sacrifices a third of their creatures, a third of their lands, discards a third of the cards in their hand, and loses a third of their life. All pretty powerful outcomes for this deck, and just stacks in general. Eventually, late game, we don't really care about mana anymore. We just care about board presence and how much power we have on the field at that time, which with tokens and all these Anthem type effects on our creatures, that's going to be a lot of power. Why not dwindle away at our opponent's resources some more? Pretty good card. We also have Siphon Mind, which each opponent discards a card. You draw a card equal to the number of cards discarded this way. Also very solid. We want card draw. We want to force our opponents to discard. Pretty simple. Then we have Ill-Gotten Gains. Each player has to discard their hand and then return 3 cards from their graveyard to their hand. Very solid. Yet again, very similar to Dark Deal. Each player is going to be discarding cards, their entire hand, which that's going to be a ton of cards they're discarding, which means you're going to get a ton of elf tokens. Pretty good. Then we have Driven to Despair, one of the newer cards from Hour of Devastation. The Driven part, we get to pay the 2 mana there to basically have whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw that many cards. And the despair part is whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, they have to discard a card for each creature that deals damage. Very powerful effect. For just 4 mana, you can do both. Pretty solid card. Now on to the final section, the instants. We just have 2 to talk about. We also play other cards as well. This isn't the entire deck. If you want to see the entire deck, check it out. It'll be in the description below. The link will be there. We play Court of Calling. Pretty good card. Probably one of the best tutors you can play in Commander, especially when it comes to creatures. We have a ton of tokens that we can easily pay the convoke cost with pretty early on, and there should be really no reason why we don't get off an epic Craterhoof win with a card like this. And we also have Kindred Summons because we love elves, and hey, why not? We also get to reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal X creature cards from the chosen type, so we get that many elves from the top of our deck equal to the number that we already have on the battlefield. So that's pretty damn epic. There's a ton of elves that we already have, and we're just going to be getting a ton of these tokens. They still technically count as elves, so we're just going to get a ton of those off the top of our deck. We can get that much from our deck just for 7 mana. That's pretty epic, and this is likely going to be a win. Very good card, very powerful addition to this type of deck. So anyway guys, that is the end of the deck tech for Nath of the Gilt-Leaf. Elf Tribal / Stacks. I don't know what you would want to call it, but it's a pretty solid build. I really like Stacks, and I really like Nath of the Gilt-Leaf for Stacks purposes, but I also feel because he makes a ton of little 1/1 green elves, it fits in perfectly to other elf strategies that already exist in Commander, and taking advantage of all the elves with Anthem type effects, the Lords, it's perfect. It fits in perfectly with tokens as well. So I absolutely love the deck. I love Golgari colors. It's probably one of my favorite color combinations. It's at least my favorite 2-color combination. But anyway, I want to thank Ogamon again, one of my awesome patrons from Patreon. If you're curious about that, the link will be in the description below. Once a month, you get to request a deck tech video or a top 10 video of your preference. Hopefully, it's something I haven't done before. Want to keep it fresh for the channel. But anyway, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off.